The air crackled with tension. The distant sound of sirens filled the night, a grim reminder of the bombs that had become a constant companion in Britain's wartime landscape. The streets were hushed, the glow of flickering gas lamps casting long shadows over the narrow alleyways. For most, this was a night like any other, marked by fear and uncertainty, but one man in a small, unassuming classroom was about to change the fate of an entire city. His name was John, a schoolteacher with little more than chalk and a blackboard to his name. He had never seen combat, had no formal military training, and was not even on the front lines of the war. Yet, in the midst of all the chaos, it would be his mind, his intellect, that would become the weapon capable of turning the tide of history. It was a cruel irony that while generals and admirals devised their strategies in lavish war rooms, it was a civilian teacher, out of place in the battlefields and war councils, who would see something they could not. The story began in a small, modest classroom at the edge of Liverpool, where John taught history to a group of eager but war-weary students. The school, like so many others, had become a refuge, not just for learning, but for a semblance of normalcy in a world torn apart by global conflict. It was here, on an ordinary day, that John would discover something so extraordinary it would change the course of history. John was teaching his students about military strategies, as many educators did during these troubled times, attempting to make sense of the incomprehensible. He knew, like everyone else, that the war would soon reach a boiling point. The Axis powers were growing bolder, the tension rising with each passing day. The Germans were tightening their grip on Europe, and their attention had now shifted to Britain. The Battle of Britain had ended in the skies above the English Channel, but now the fight was moving to the ground. It was a quiet Wednesday when John first encountered the anomaly. His students were distracted, their minds far from the chalkboard in front of them, as the sounds of distant bombs reverberated through the walls. John could hardly blame them. He himself had grown numb to the constant thud of explosions. Yet, it was during this routine lesson, as he scrolled through historical military maps, that his eyes fell on something peculiar. A detail, small, insignificant to most, caught his attention, and in that moment, the world around him seemed to slow. There, on the map of Western Europe, was a planned Axis invasion route that didn't quite add up. It wasn't a glaring mistake, nothing that would have sent alarms ringing in the corridors of power. But John, with his deep understanding of geography and military logistics, saw it immediately. The route, an intricate series of coordinated strikes aimed at cutting off British reinforcements, was flawed. It was not a flaw in execution, but in the very nature of the plan itself. A crucial miscalculation in the geography of the land, the positioning of the enemy's supply lines, and the terrain of northern France would leave a vital opening. The Germans were about to attack Britain through a path they hadn't anticipated would be a bottleneck. John saw it as clearly as he saw the chalk in his hand. But what could he do with this knowledge? He was just a teacher, after all. What could his discovery, so hidden in the folds of maps and military doctrine, possibly mean to the war effort? He knew he had no authority, no power, no means to influence the course of events. The discovery gnawed at him like a splinter deep in his mind. He had no choice but to share it. The next morning, after much deliberation, John sent a letter to the War Office. It was an unassuming thing, just a few words, a brief explanation, and a map with a note about the potential weakness in the enemy strategy. He wasn't sure if anyone would even read it, let alone believe him. After all, what did a history teacher know about military tactics? The thought lingered in his mind for days as the battle raged on around him, but the weight proved unbearable. Weeks passed with no response. He heard nothing. The war continued. Liverpool, still reeling from the effects of bombing raids, carried on under a constant cloud of dread. In the hearts of many, fear had settled in like an old companion. Would this war ever end? Would the bombs ever stop falling? And then, on a chilly February morning, John's letter was finally noticed, not by those in positions of power or authority, but by a group of junior military analysts who happened to stumble upon it. They were skeptical at first, dismissing the teacher's theory as the musings of an amateur. After all, What did a civilian know about military strategy? But as they carefully examined the information, something remarkable happened. The flaw John had pointed out was real. It was not just a minor oversight, but a strategic vulnerability that, if exploited, could turn the tide of the war. The problem was that this oversight, this simple mistake in planning, had been overlooked by the highest-ranking military officials in both Britain and Germany. It was a small detail, buried in the larger plans of the war, but was enough to give the British a chance to thwart a German attack that could have decimated Liverpool, possibly even turning the city into another casualty of war. As word of John's discovery began to spread, it quickly moved up the chain of command, landing in the hands of senior military officials. The reality of the situation hit them hard. How could they have missed something so critical? How could they have been blind to a vulnerability that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight? It was the kind of mistake that could cost them everything. Now, in the corridors of power, there was a sense of urgency. But John, who had made the discovery, had no idea that his letter was being taken seriously. He continued his work in the classroom, uncertain of what was unfolding around him. As the military leaders of Britain scrambled to verify the information, they quickly saw the potential for victory. A plan was drawn up to exploit the German weakness, but it was a plan that could not, and would not, be implemented without the cooperation of those who had made the initial mistake. Despite the bluster and bravado of the military officials, the Germans were unaware that they had just lost their advantage. The shift in tactics was subtle, almost invisible, but it was enough. John's discovery had become the pivot on which the fate of a city hung. However, even as the first signs of victory emerged, the true weight of John's role in this success remained hidden from the public. His name, his contribution, would be erased, lost in the bureaucracy of the war effort. Military history, as it often does, would remember the generals and the admirals, not the quiet schoolteacher who had turned the course of events with nothing but his intellect and his understanding of geography. The paradox was clear. An outsider, someone with no claim to the halls of power, had seen what the experts had missed. His knowledge, so basic yet so critical, had been dismissed, ignored, and ultimately erased. But in the quiet of his classroom, far from the celebrations and the accolades of victory, John knew the truth. He had made a difference. The real question was, how many others like him had been forgotten, their contributions erased by the systems that claimed to protect them? The world would move on, and Liverpool would remain standing. But John's name would fade into the shadows, lost to the very institutions that should have recognized him. In that fleeting moment of realization, one thing became painfully clear. The war, and its history, would remember the heroes in uniform, but not the quiet teachers who had the courage to think differently. The city of London, though battered by months of relentless air raids, was still standing, its resilience as formidable as the people within it. In the darkened halls of the War Office, the air was thick with tension, and every face seemed weathered by the burden of the times. The war was entering its darkest phase, the pressure mounting on everyone in the building. Generals, strategists, and officers moved through the corridors like ghosts, their minds clouded by the weight of the conflict. Their eyes, once sharp with the clarity of purpose, were now dull with the exhaustion of failure, as they had watched plan after plan fail to achieve a decisive victory. The weight of their own pride and missteps seemed unbearable. In this labyrinth of bureaucracy, one man, John, the schoolteacher from Liverpool, was now an unlikely figure of focus. His letter, once dismissed as a trivial observation, had become the turning point in a war that threatened to swallow everything. It was clear to everyone in the War Office that the time to act was now. John's discovery was no longer just an interesting anomaly. It was a lifeline. The German attack that had once seemed unstoppable now seemed vulnerable to exploitation, thanks to the tiny but critical oversight he had uncovered. But as the news spread up the chain of command, one truth became painfully evident. John, the teacher, had no real power. His discovery might have been a game changer, but it was the military's job to make use of it. Unfortunately, John, who had seen the flaw so clearly, had no means of ensuring that his insight would be executed properly. His name was still a whisper, a shadow in the background of this unfolding drama. It was the military elite who were now in control. The contrast was striking. The teachers who had once taught history in peaceful classrooms were now suddenly involved in saving lives in a war that had stripped everything of its innocence. And in this new, grim reality, John was once again an outsider, a mere civilian, a voice in a room filled with men whose careers and lives had been built on decisions far more complicated and far more lethal than anything John had ever known. The war offices were filled with experts, people who had spent years studying military tactics, people who had risen through the ranks by virtue of their expertise in warfare. Their world was one of calculation, strategy, and bitter experience. Yet, here they were, turning to John, the schoolteacher, to see what could be done with the knowledge he had stumbled upon. The first meeting was a tense one. John entered the war office, nervous but determined. The room was filled with men whose uniforms and badges spoke of power, but it was John who had the only knowledge that could change the course of the war. It was a strange feeling, stepping into this world of military men, his words now carrying a weight they never had before. The military officials sat around a long, polished table, their faces unreadable, but their eyes were sharp, assessing. John tried his best to explain how the Germans had planned their assault on Liverpool, how the terrain and geography of northern France had been miscalculated. He explained how the Germans were counting on a swift march through a series of roads and ports that, in reality, would bottleneck their supply lines, leaving them vulnerable to a counterattack. Yet, as John spoke, it became painfully clear that his very presence was an intrusion. The officers were skeptical, their minds stuck in the world of traditional warfare. They had not seen the battlefield through the lens of a teacher, someone who had spent years looking at maps, not for military advantage, but for historical context. His knowledge of geography, his understanding of how human movements unfolded in history, was an asset, but one that none of these men had the patience to truly grasp. As John explained the details of the German strategy, one officer, Colonel Edwards, interrupted him. He was a man whose career had been built on battlefield success, yet here he was unable to fathom how a civilian could have seen something so crucial. "This is all theoretical," Colonel Edwards snapped. "We need action, not conjecture. You're asking us to gamble with our soldiers' lives on something that you've merely guessed at." John, despite his nerves, stood his ground. He repeated the facts, the details of the miscalculation, all of which could be verified by the intelligence reports that had been overlooked or dismissed. But even as he spoke, he knew that these men, entrenched in their military mindset, could not see the flaw. They were too steeped in the traditions of warfare, too comfortable in the strategies that had been used for centuries, to understand that innovation could come from outside their circle. John's insight, his understanding of geography and historical patterns, was a form of intelligence that could save lives, but it wasn't the kind of intelligence they respected. The meeting dragged on, with military officers offering their own explanations, dismissing John's discovery as an outlier, something unworthy of immediate action. The irony of it wasn't lost on John. How many times had military leaders dismissed the ideas of outsiders? How often had their rigid, institutional thinking led them into disaster? The paradox was as evident as the mistake he had uncovered. The very system that had failed to see the flaw was now rejecting the very solution that could prevent disaster. Days passed, and the silence was deafening. John continued teaching, his mind unable to leave the war office, the men who refused to see what he had seen. The battle continued to rage, and Liverpool, his city, was still in danger. He couldn't understand how, after everything he had revealed, the military could be so unwilling to act. But then, as if out of nowhere, there was a glimmer of hope. A junior officer, Lieutenant Hall, had been present in the meeting and had been quietly reviewing the maps and reports John had presented. While the high-ranking officers dismissed him, Lieutenant Hall could see the importance of John's insight. Unlike the others, he wasn't entrenched in tradition. He wasn't focused on preserving his own reputation. He was simply a man who wanted to do what was right. Lieutenant Hall quietly took John's letter, his maps, and began to work behind the scenes, gathering a team of experts who would take a closer look at the flaw John had pointed out. In his office late at night, Hall pored over the details of the strategy, cross-referencing John's claims with intelligence reports, and confirming that the Germans had indeed underestimated the geography of the region. It was an error that could not be ignored. Hall quickly realized that if the British acted swiftly and exploited this weakness, the German advance could be delayed long enough for reinforcements to arrive, buying Liverpool precious time. But even as Hall moved forward, the resistance was palpable. The military machine, though slowly starting to shift, was still mired in bureaucratic inertia. There were endless debates, calculations, and committee meetings that seemed to go in circles. Every new idea or suggestion was met with reluctance. The establishment was, by its nature, designed to resist change, to cling to old ways of thinking, even when they were no longer effective. The irony was bitter. The greatest opportunity for victory had been found not by the military, but by a civilian who had simply dared to think differently. But would it be enough? The weeks dragged on, with the city of Liverpool bracing itself for the worst. The war was not just a battle of armies. It was a battle of wills, of power structures, and of pride. John, the teacher, had uncovered the enemy's blind spot, but he had become a cog in the greater machine, his role overlooked by those who had been trained to make the decisions. And yet, despite the systemic resistance, the truth remained undeniable. An outsider had provided the key to victory, but it was still up to the system to decide whether to use it. John had no way of knowing whether his discovery would ultimately save Liverpool. His name would likely remain unknown, and his role would be forgotten in the grand sweep of history. But in the shadows of the War Office, Lieutenant Hall continued to push forward, challenging the very structure that had dismissed the teacher's insight. There, in that quiet battle of wills, the fight for the city was still very much alive. And the question lingered. Could an outsider, someone with no training in war, be the very one who saved them all? The morning light shone dimly through the overcast skies, casting a gray pallor over the docks of Liverpool. The streets, once bustling with the hum of daily life, now felt heavy, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The war had transformed everything. Time had slowed, and the ever-present threat of bombing raids had become part of the city's heartbeat. Yet, despite the gloom, Liverpool had not fallen. The discovery made by a small-town teacher had become the crux of a strategy that, unbeknownst to the world, would save the city from a fate worse than any air raid. But as the dust settled and the dustbins were cleared of debris, something much more troubling began to emerge. The cost of victory and the strange, silent erasure of the very man who had made it possible. John, the teacher from Liverpool, had watched from the sidelines as the military, reluctantly at first, began to follow his lead. The flaw he had uncovered in the enemy's plans had been real, as irrefutable as the maps he had shown the officers in the War Office. The Germans, having underestimated the geography of northern France, had placed themselves in a position of vulnerability. The British had moved quickly, exploiting this weakness, and the enemy's advance had been delayed long enough to allow reinforcements to flood into Liverpool, fortifying its defenses and giving the city a chance at survival.